So we've got a lot to cover. This relates to critical period. This is a topic that I've worked on for some time and I've fallen in and out of love with. We're going to look at what goes on in critical period research in terms of the actual scope, try to define and conceptualize what critical periods are, looking at what experiences and what biology go into critical periods, and then we're going to look at how these have particular influence on acquisition of language and on bilingualism. We know that there are impediments to second language acquisition. We're going to look at these briefly. I have a long handout that's very dense, and again, we're going to go through this quickly, but it's on paper, so you don't have to take notes on this. What we will know about simultaneous or early bilingualism is that it's not even late acquisition, but also early bilingualism is going to diverge from monolingual first language acquisition outcomes. And by the way, when I talk about bilinguals, I'm not talking about quote-unquote perfect bilinguals where there's balance and both languages are spoken equally fluidly. Bilinguals for me are people who regularly use two languages, irrespective of the proficiencies in those languages. We're going to look about bilingualism over the lifespan. Then we're going to apply the critical period hypothesis to the context of second language acquisition and look at the predictions of the CPH-L2A as well as the evidence for and against it. One of the things in particular we're going to spend some time on is about native-like attainment and whether really it is something that the critical period hypothesis should be interested in as a theoretical perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about the geometry and the timing, the characteristics over the lifespan of critical periods with respect to second language acquisition, and how age of attainment, AOA, age of acquisition, maps on to critical period functions or not. In this part here, I understood that there was going to be some people from French, so I put in a little chunk of stuff that really particularly relates to French as learned by late Anglophone learners. And then towards the end, we're going to look critically at some new research that relates to critical period versus education. And then at the end, there's a little interesting foray into large data and what you can do with large data with respect to the critical period hypothesis and modeling critical period functions with large data. So those are the topics. Started with the scope. Critical periods are just about everywhere, and you can talk about critical periods in a whole bunch of different ways. I was asked to put together an annotated bibliography by Oxford University Press, who have a bibliography in linguistics, and it's under review at this point. Here are the things that I looked at. Things like animal models, animals in critical periods. You may have heard about barn owls and cat visions and so forth. What are the external factors that contribute to critical periods? Within humans, it's not just about language. There's a critical period for absolute pitch. There's a critical period for autism. There's a critical period for addiction. And with respect to things like addiction, this is a very interesting perspective. When we think about critical periods, we often think about it in terms of opportunity, right? You're successful if you do X within critical period. With respect to addiction, it's a period of vulnerability. So it's within, for example, post-adolescent ages that one is susceptible to particular types of addiction. That's a vulnerability sensitivity as opposed to something that gives you a positive outcome. There's been a lot of work with respect to first language acquisition, second language acquisition as well, and we're going to look in particular to the geometry and timing, as well as brain-based studies of critical periods in second language acquisition. Bilinguals come into play here, as do attriters, people who lose their first language and shift their dominance from the L1 to the L2 and back and forth sometimes. Sign language has been studied within the critical period paradigm, And foreign language teaching and education has based a lot of its policy on research that has been done with respect to critical periods. So what is a critical period? I'm going to read these out, and these are, I think, generic features of critical periods without reference to any kind of phenomenon in particular. A critical period is a bounded, that's the period part, maturational span. Maturation means that there's something about biology within a certain period of aging, during which developmental processes are optimally organized to determine certain species-specific system-level outcomes. Species-specific, and then at a level that is not very local, it's actually at a system level. Putting a finer point on this, critical periods are developmental epochs of enhanced sensitivity. What do we mean by sensitivity? It's the susceptibility of a biological system to influences of relevant information and experience. So we've got sensitivity, we've got biology, we've got experience that are all kind of captured in the notion of critical period. We know another thing about critical periods, and that is that plasticity is not always confined to a critical period. And so there are biological factors and experiential factors which contribute to the extension of neuroplasticity beyond the presumed maturational bound of a critical period. We're going to talk about this with some real science in a minute. If you need to define a critical period, you want to be able to signal a qualitative change in the developmental readiness. That signal is a departure from linearity in the function that relates sensitivity to outcome. So if you're looking at a critical period, you want to see something like this, one of many options. So plateau and then decline of sensitivity, as opposed to a straight line linearity function. And the idea is when you have this departure from linearity, that signals some sort of qualitative change in whatever the biology and experience is. If it was straight line, there wouldn't have this qualitative change. And when you have these departures from linearity, they should line up with what we know about the maturational process of the species. So here's from a government publication, a sort of schematic of three different kinds of critical periods in humans. In the dark red, we have seeing and hearing and touch. In the orange, language and speech, and in the blue, we got the higher cognitive functions. And what you'll see here is these departures from linearity. So there's an increased sensitivity, there's something of a peak or plateau, a decline, and in these particular examples, there is a sharp decline and then a less sharp decline, a sort of less steep function after a certain developmental point. This particular graphic talks about age 0 to 8. Some people would put the timing a little differently, but for us the schematic is this. You've got an increase of sensitivity, a peak, a decline, and maybe a lesser decline thereafter. So maturation and aging, two different things. Okay, maturation is a bounded, that's period, phase within general aging. So general aging is chronological age. Maturation is a specific biological epoch. And so when you're looking at age effects, you have to distinguish them from maturational effects, and we're going to talk about that. If you're thinking age effects, you're probably thinking something that's linear and unbounded. When you're thinking about critical period effects, you're thinking about something that is nonlinear and bounded. So the geometry and timing of critical periods is different from the functions that we see over age, which are unbounded and linear. So in second language acquisition, just to make a couple of clarification points here, age of acquisition, that's AOA, are actually age-related effects. Why? Because the initial state of L2 acquisition, that is the age of acquisition or the age of exposure, really connects to a lot of different factors. One being the developmental state of the first language. That's, as you can imagine, that's the first language. Then the age-conditioned linguistic experience in both the L1 and the L2. Cognitive aging, which is a general decline over age in cognitive function. Likewise for hormonal and neurochemical variations, as well as psychosocial identification. People are really studying the psychosocial identification side now because, think about it, if you don't want to be like a person who speaks that second language, you're not going to be like that person. So there's a motivational component. All these other components, that's one thing. But if you don't care, then all the other factors are just irrelevant. So the identification has to do with integration into society. It has to do with changing your mentality somewhat to take up the values of the society and to kind of be integrated and like. So let me throw these out here. These are obviously some discontinuous functions here, and I'm just going to walk you through them really quickly. On the vertical axis, you've got ultimate attainment, meaning the endpoint of second language acquisition. At an early age, that's on the horizontal axis, you're going to have the peak of attainment. In other words, start early, high attainment. And then on the left side here, we have a stretched L geometry. Attainment goes down and then levels off. A stretched 7 on the right is you have a peak, in other words, this period there of a plateau of sensitivity, and then it's followed by a decline that doesn't stop. On the L side, the decline levels off. On the stretched 7, there is no end to the decline. And the discontinuity obviously is early on in the 7 and later in the stretched L, it's later. Stretch Z is kind of a hybrid of these two. You have a sort of peak at the top, a decline, and then a leveling off. And various researchers conceptualize critical periods for second language acquisition in one of these three ways. And it's maddening to me when people don't actually say what they mean geometrically and temporally when they're talking about critical period. And it's taken the field a long time to be specific about this. The other thing I was going to say is, if you think about critical periods, these are kind of really different. You know, stretched L is a different phenomenon than a stretched 7. And so I've always had a little problem with the field which cannot sort of decide what it is. Is it an L or is it a 7? Or is it a Z? The field is often confusing also with respect to where that critical period boundary is. So some folks look at the plateau as the critical period. Some people look at everything going down to the leveling off as the critical period. So there's this conception and there's this conception. On the stretched L side, this is the conception. So the critical period is the entire decline, but not the leveling off. And on the stretched 7, we've got this where it's only the plateau. So these are out there in the world of research, and not everybody's clear when they're talking about that or that or that. So be careful as you're reading through the literature to see what it is that people are actually referring to when they say critical period. And again, these are schematics. If you map these on to nonlinear models, they don't look like these, acute breaks from linearity. They're much smoother, S-shaped, for example. This is a graphic that displays a study that was done by Johnson and Newport, for which the geometry is stretched L. Those are the dotted lines. And then a replication study that I, myself, and graduate student Michelle Molis did, where we replicated the study and our geometry turned out to look more like the 7. Johnson and Newport, you may have read about Johnson and Newport, used Korean and Chinese native speakers and as their subjects, and Birdsong and Mullis used Spanish. The items correct are on the vertical, and this is from a grammaticality judgment test. And what you'll see on the horizontal is increasing age. So in both, you get this kind of age effect, and one of them gives you an L geometry, and one of them gives you a 7-shaped geometry. A lot of people have speculated as to why we got a different result from Johnson and Newport, but there they are. These are real figures. Now, one of the things that is interesting is that Johnson and Newport sort of stipulated early versus late as having a break point at 16 years of age of acquisition. And so you'll see where their lines stop and start, and they're indicated with the blue. So Johnson and Newport did it with Chinese and Korean. Birdsong and Mullis did it with Spanish, and you'll see that the breakpoints are there at 16. Now, as it turned out, we didn't stop there. We did some subsequent analyses, and without stipulating 16 as the breakpoint, we ran what's called a piecewise regression. I'm not going to get into this, but if you let the program do what it's going to do, the actual breakpoint for Birdsong and Mullis is at 27 years. So the decline actually starts not at 16, but at 27. People have said, well, it's because it's Spanish and it's because it's morphology, and the decline starts later. And then you have to say, well, why should it start later than the Chinese? And you have to make up a story about that. But these are actual findings. Everybody see this okay? Okay. I'm going to run through these really quickly here. A recent study by Granina and Long talks about multiple critical periods. So they're looking at the area of pronunciation, lexis, and morphosyntax. And what they're finding is that, by the way, the native speaker controls are these black diamonds. And then there's an early arrival, later arrival, and the latest arrival. I think the early arrivals are circles, and then we've got triangles and X's. And what you'll see is that the geometries and timings of all three of these differ. So the notion here is that you've got multiple critical periods. Critical period from pronunciation decline starts earlier than the decline for lexis, which starts earlier than the decline for morphosyntax, which is consistent with a lot of stuff that people have said all along. There's not just a critical period, but it varies depending on what you're measuring. As it turns out, my collaborator Jan van Hoven and I looked at this and sort of thought about it for a minute, and you know, these are not the same tests, and they're not the same designs, and not the same dependent variables, and so you have to be a little bit careful because you're not mapping the results over three similar functions or ideal functions, because these are three different tests and three different dependent variables. So, you know, grain of salt. The discontinuities issue, Van Hove, who is a super statistician, looked at this and he reanalyzed all of it. And these discontinuities, as far as where they occur and to the degree that they do occur, really depends on how you do your stats. So what I'm telling you right here in these kind of grain of salt examples is there's a lot of research that's going behind one set of research and reanalyzing it, and then contributing to a lot of the controversy that goes with critical period research. Van Hove did something kind of interesting, which we have over here in blue, with some results that came out in 2010 by Robert de Keyser and colleagues. Jan reanalyzed these results with North American participants, and I won't go through this in any detail, but the nonlinear function accounted for 66% of the variance. The linear function that was mapped onto it accounted for 65% of the variance. So you may be able to get away with this conception that a linear function captures a lot of the phenomenon, and that you may not necessarily have to have a nonlinear function in order to get the same sort of mapping of AOA onto results. Everybody get that? See, the dotted line is the linear function, and the original de Keyser was the broken, the sort of discontinuous solid line. So again, controversy. So we've got all this in critical period, but we have to kind of backtrack and say, well, you know, when you get older, stuff happens, right? Anybody old enough to kind of relate to that? You guys, you know, you're just saying, oh my God, it's like my granddad talking here, my mom or dad, you know, they're always kind of just beat up over getting older. Well, everybody's going to get older eventually, okay? Everybody's going to die eventually too. But before you die, you're going to have all this other stuff going on. And this is the stuff that is an impediment to a lot of different things, including language acquisition, second language acquisition. And in red, I talk about specific things that I'm interested in under brain maturation, under the entrenchment of the first language, and the fact that the second language talks to the first language in various different ways. We're going to spend a lot of time about that. There's a declining impetus to become native-like as well. Cognitive aging is domain general, but it affects all kinds of cognitive functions, including language. And the cognitive aging phenomena are related to structural and biochemical changes in the brain. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip over a lot of this, and I'm going to let you take these home with you. I brought them. This is state of Texas government, you know, at their expense. Virginia didn't have to pay for any of this. And I will simply put a few of the ideas that are associated with this piece of paper. The effects, be they separate or cumulative, vary from individual to individual. So there's no single one-size-fits-all story. Individual differences. If you study psychology, that's one of the areas of studies, individual differences. On these effects, which are age conditioned, the magnitude of the effects tends to correlate with AOA. So the older, the bigger the effects. As concerns geometry and timing, it is not clear that these particular impediments map onto a critical period discontinuous function. And on the handout, I'm going to talk about specifics of these particular areas as relates to second language acquisition. What I'm going to do in the next 3 slides or 4 slides is really concentrate on the shape of the function that relates to cognitive aging, dopamine, and regional brain volume decreases over age, and that gets really hairy. Okay, if you look up here, you'll see the research that's being done in the area of cognitive aging. With respect to things like digit span and recall, you'll see a decline that is pretty doggone straight line over, beginning at 20 years of age. The other more or less flat but actually slightly increasing functions are related to vocabulary. And what these particular functions tell us is the number of lexical items that you put in your mental dictionary over age. You learn new vocabulary as you get older, okay? As you get older, you may not be able to retrieve that vocabulary. That's not up on here. I mean, that's a sad fact. But you have a larger dictionary, larger mental dictionary as you go older. My example used to be iPod. We didn't have iPods, you know, back in whatever. And now my example is twerking. You know, not that long ago, we didn't know what twerking is, okay? And now we've got a new vocabulary item. Everybody, I guess. I gave this talk to a European, or gave this slide to a European audience, and they didn't know what I was talking about when I said twerking. And I said, well, it's provocative dance move or whatever. So. And what we see here is something that really doesn't look like a 7 geometry. Now, one of the things that is kind of cool is this may be masking a V-shaped function. Remember when we saw the original slides where it went up and then down? We call that an inverted V. This slide only starts at 20 years of age. And what we can expect is that we're going to have increases up to about 20 years of age. You get smarter and smarter, and you talk faster and faster, and process language better and better, and you can do mental arithmetic and digit span and recall of numbers and so forth. And then at age 20, it starts to go down. So this may be looking something like this in reality, starting at age 0. In dopamine declines, dopamine, gosh, if you study now any neurochemistry and neurobiology, you're going to be fascinated by the role of dopamine. And I'm not going to go through all the things that it relates to, but I have a slide. This slide talks about all the things that dopamine affects in terms of language processing and brain areas as well. And if you look at the AOA function with respect to dopamine, you get pretty much the same picture. It's either this kind of inverted V or it's a 7. Now, that 7 means something like, again, maybe a plateau at age 18 and then a decline starting at maybe age 20. And the onsets of these effects are task dependent, and that's very important to keep in mind. It's not one size fits all. I was also going to say that the kinds of things that go on in the brain in terms of cognitive aging, it's not just dopamine. Cortisol, does everybody know about cortisol? Cortisol is great. You need cortisol in order to make quick decisions and fight or flight kind of stuff. Attention really depends on cortisol levels. If you have too high cortisol levels, then it starts to eat away at your memory areas, your hippocampus in particular. And how do you get high cortisol levels? Stress. If you want to slow down cognitive aging, take stress out of your life. Meditate. Get a lot of sleep. Don't go into politics. I was going to say don't go into an academic department, but that would be the wrong message. This is a cool slide here, and these are regions of interest, ROI, and these are various regions of the brain. And brain volume starts to decline about age 20, and then depending on the area, it can decline maybe 1% a year. This particular research was in vivo, so they're actually not taking dead people and measuring brain volumes, but they're looking at folks over their lifespan and measuring the declines over decades. And what you're seeing is linear declines that start in adolescence, by and large. Okay? And what is not so good about this research is that the volume can come down, but we don't know what threshold it has to hit before we have cognitive effects. So you can decrease, for example, the areas of the prefrontal cortex, the putamen, the temporal lobes, and so forth, but it has to hit a point before you actually have some sort of measurable cognitive decrement. And so if there is something that we can characterize this, it kind of looks like a 7 geometry. But again, we don't know where that decline would actually begin, the actual functional decline would begin. So here we go. Now we're going to talk about second language acquisition, and we're going to start with the word deficits in order to start making sense of this. We've just seen all these well-studied impediments, okay, and there are others. And the deficit model of the field of SLA, I use SLA as the discipline and L2A as the phenomenon, looks at what learners can't or don't do because of age-related impediments, and this is what adherents of the second language acquisition critical period hypothesis are interested in. They're interested in deficits, not interested in what you can do or might be able to do. They're all about stuff that goes wrong. Okay, that's the deficit stuff. I have another presentation that talks about capacities model as opposed to deficit models, but we're not going to get into that as well. So here comes native likeness, becoming indistinguishable from a monolingual, an adult monolingual. And what the people who study the critical period hypothesis for second language acquisition do is use this non-native-like attainment as evidence for the CPH, okay? And then they take it a step further and they say this: find me native likeness, and then all bets are off. Native likeness would serve as a way to reject or falsify the critical period hypothesis. So we know that there's a decline. We know that people don't become native-like, but if you found one native-like person, would that be sufficient to reject the CPH? It goes further, and it goes something like this. Find these people, but you have to be careful. These folks, native-like, would have to be native-like across every possible measure. Everything. Okay? Every imaginable linguistic feature, domain, performance, processing, pronunciation, everything. And then you have to look at these microscopic analyses. So this is called linguistic scrutiny. So across the board, under scrutiny. And one example of this is a recent article that looked at L1 Spanish, L2 Swedish, and looked at voice onset time, which I'll talk about in a minute. For word initial PTK in Swedish, they measured it in milliseconds, and they also did a secondary analysis that looked at word duration and milliseconds within the word duration, so there was a kind of ratio thing going on to reflect speech rate. Well, their findings were extraordinarily local. They had to do with a K, they had to do with a couple of people in their subject pool, and so they couldn't find enough people to say, well, this group can behave native-like. If you got into the details, they did not. And so this is an example of a study that found that across the board, native-likeness was not observed under linguistic scrutiny. By the way, if you want to know about voice onset time, this relates to obstruents, PTK Pudige, and then we have a question of when voicing takes place, relating to when the closure of the lips takes place or the closure of the articulated. The squiggly lines are voicing, vocal cord vibration, and this depends from language to language to language as to the timing, the voice onset timing of the voice plosives versus the unaspirated voiceless versus the aspirated voiceless. So languages vary from with respect to the actual timing of that voicing. And what the idea is that if you have attained native likeness, then you have exactly the criterial VOTs in the target language. And if you don't, you're not native-like. So the question that I'm asking is something like this. We know that there are biological constraints. The adherents and proponents to the CPH require scrutinized monolingual native-likes. Got to be just like a monolingual, and that's the criterion for rejecting the CPH. And my question is this really a reasonable criterion? And I don't think it is, and I'll tell you why. If you're a bilingual, and again, bilinguals are just people who routinely use languages, irrespective of performance and proficiency. The languages influence each other. We know this. The L1 is influenced by the L2. It's not just the L2 influences the L1. And as you get into bilingualism, you find this, and it seems to be ignored by the CPH people. And these are the various areas in which the languages influence one another. Knowing this, it has been, since the 80s, it's been maintained by people like François Grosjean that there's no such thing as two monolinguals in one person. It just doesn't happen. Why? The two languages are influencing each other. So the L2 of a bilingual is not monolingual-like in all respects, nor is the L1. So I call this the nature of bilingualism. Both languages are subject to bilingualism effects under this model of nature of bilingualism. Taking it a step further, this is where it really gets cool. Bilingualism effects are expected among late and early / simultaneous bilinguals. So think about it. Simultaneous, bilingual, early AOA. Ooh, wait, critical period is about early AOA. But bilinguals, no matter what their AOA, are going to have this reciprocal influence. No such thing as two monolinguals in one. And so finally, I would say something like this. Non-monolingual likeness in both languages is inherent in the nature of bilingualism among all active bilinguals, no matter what their AOA. And for that reason, I believe that this across-the-board or comprehensive monolingual native likeness is really not a reasonable criterion for falsifying the CPH in late second language acquisition. Now, I'm going to take this a few steps further. Is everybody okay with the logic of this? It's actually, nobody who studies bilingualism would take issue with this. But let's look for a second at late bilinguals, okay? But late meaning starting after age 12, maybe 15 maybe, in adulthood. Under the CP account, the L2 will deterministically be non-monolingual. Under the nature of bilingualism account, neither the L2 nor the L1 is going to be monolingual like in adulthood, okay? So two different predictions, one relating to L2 only, that's a CP, and then the other relating both to the L1 and the L2, and that's under the NOB. That's late bilingualism. What about early or simultaneous bilingualism? Under the CP account, both the L2 and the L1 could be monolingual in adulthood. But under the nature of bilingualism account, neither the L2 nor the L1 could be monolingual like. Okay, so in summary, this is what we've got. L2 of simultaneous early bilinguals, the CPH says native like. Nature of bilingualism says non-native like. Jump over here to the right to the L1 of bilinguals. Well, CPH says native like, nature of bilingualism says non-native like, and the L2 of late bilinguals, which is in the middle column there, both accounts, both models would say non-native like. Now, nature of bilingualism sounds like really fatalistic and really, yuck. I would like to be native like. Well, bilinguals can be spectacular, but they're not going to be like monolinguals because the L2 is going to be activated and the L1 is going to be activated all the time. You can look at it in brain function. You can look at it in things called priming. You can look at it as lexical retrieval. All of these things happen in bilingualism. Your L2 is talking to your L1. Your L1 is talking to your L2. Okay, so this is what's going on from the CPH versus NOB. What is the biochemistry of critical periods? Let's back up and look at this. I'm not going to go into this into super detail other than to say this, that this just came out into 2015. Hench is a biochemist and an MD at Harvard, and he's been working on the biochemistry of critical periods for a long time. Janet Worker is a developmental psycholinguist who works with infants and is particularly interested in discrimination of sounds in early infancy. So what we've got here is something that looks pretty similar to those original graphics that I had. So you've got an increase of neuroplasticity that happens pretty early on and dramatically. In this purple shaded area, that's where Hench talks about what the critical period is. So it's not just the peak, it's a before the peak and after the peak. Preceding the plasticity increase is something called breaks. You can't do it. And at the end, you have breaks as well. And there are biochemical reasons for this. There is a dynamic of the excitatory and inhibitory neurons that goes throughout these age functions. And over here at the top, I love the way that this is set out with dotted and solid lines. So the solid line is typical and normal, and the dotted lines are different, abnormal. So early is precocious in the pink dotted lines. A delayed or reopened critical period is in the dotted blue lines. That can happen. Sometimes we have extended critical periods, that's the purple dotted line, and then also narrowed critical periods, depending a lot on the individual's biochemistry. We can imagine in D a critical period that never closes. We have also a critical period that never opens. That would be an environmental influence usually. And then we can have a dampened critical period where the plasticity doesn't go up to the normal heights. I love this article. It's pretty detailed. This is the cellular level or neuronal level of what's going on. I'm not going to go through this. There's a lot of stuff, but it's been studied down to the cellular level is what I'm talking about by biochemists. The way this plays out in perceptual development goes something like this. You've got these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages in language development, and what we're talking about in the first 4 are discrimination abilities. And these play out over the period of birth to 20 months. In fact, some of these sensitivities begin before birth, if you look over here, so prenatally. Discrimination function in the solid lines in blue, and then extended in the broken lines in blue. Same thing for the orange, where we're talking about native phonetic categories. Similarly for the word forms, which is in purple, which goes way back here, so it's much more extended than the discrimination in phonetic categories, and then the phonological categories. You put all these things together and you're ready to start listening to real words and language and maybe even producing this by the time you're 28 months old. And this is where it gets cool, guys. How can you modify the critical period? How can you, for example, extend the critical period? Well, I've put a little box around valproate exposure. It turns out that by administering this anticonvulsant, mood stabilizer basically, you can extend critical period. Now, this is kind of interesting stuff, but this is exposure post-birth, usually by the mother. Now, check this out. This is what people are now doing with valproate. They're looking at critical periods with respect to acquisition of absolute pitch or perfect pitch. And so this is called the learning drug, and it can reawaken grown-up brains in inner child. Down at the bottom, want to be maestros? Listen up. A mood-stabilizing drug can help you achieve perfect pitch, the ability to identify any note you hear without inferring it from a reference note. Excuse me. So this is what's being done with valproate. Well, as it turns out, that's good for people who want to learn absolute pitch, but it's not very good when you're talking about autism. Oops, sorry. Because valproate exposure can induce autism. And this has been studied in rats and has also been studied in pregnant mothers in the first trimester of pregnancy. And what happens there is that cognitive impairment in the newborn is observed by taking valproate during pregnancy. So valproate is not your miracle drug, because if you take it in one critical period, it has deleterious effects. If you take it during another critical period, it can extend the critical period. What else can extend the critical period? Bilingual experience. So if you're learning 2 languages at once, the critical period that we had back here can be extended like in the dotted lines. So bilingual experience can help in that respect. So what about the bilingual child? So you've got a couple of things going on. When simultaneous acquisition of multiple languages and respect to perceptual narrowing, that is, singling down onto a single phoneme, it can happen in the same time frame as monolinguals. It can extend the duration of critical period past monolingual ranges, and sometimes it's because native categories have been longer to establish. Sometimes it's a question of just extending this period to an older age. Sometimes it's a question of less input. Sometimes it's, this is pretty interesting. When you're listening to two languages, you don't have monolingual-like exposure. You have half of the exposure that you would have in one language and half in the other language. That's the asymmetric relative frequency. And then a lot of people are looking at the executive control, the ability to concentrate and switch your attention and focus is enhanced when you're a bilingual. The extension could also happen because that the neurocircuitry is less mature in bilinguals, and another possibility is that circuitry is equally mature, but it involves different circuits, so you're recruiting different parts of the brain, or you have greater connectivity in certain areas of the brain. I think what I'm going to do is just give you one example of this. This is an example of delayed acquisition, but successful. And if anyone knows the difference between the vowel systems of Spanish and the vowel system of Catalan, Catalan has a distinction between the high E and the lower, more open E that Spanish does not have. And so if you're bilingual, you have a problem with, if you're working with Spanish and Catalan as a bilingual child, you're going to have a problem making this distinction between these two phonetic categories when you're using Catalan. And so here's a Catalan monolingual over here on the left. At 8 months, Catalan Spanish does not make a distinction. Catalan Spanish bilinguals do not make that distinction. But by the time you get to 12 months, you see that the Catalan Spanish bilingual is doing very similar to the Catalan monolingual at 8 months. So this particular feature is acquired later. So in some sense, the critical period has been extended. So what happens when you get to adults who were simultaneous or early bilinguals, okay? Well, it's variable. Why? Because you have asymmetric exposure to the two languages. You have asymmetric use of the languages in terms of attrition, that's loss of a language, in terms of language dominance. You can, this is really interesting. When you're exposed as a bilingual, you may be listening to accented speech in one or both of the languages. You're not going to always be listening to monolinguals. You're going to be listening to people who actually have accented speech in one or more of the languages. So the way the research has played out is that some people have looked at the native likeness, and this was done by Mack, and I'm not going to run through it. Other people have emphasized the non-native likeness at local levels. More to come when we look at across-the-board analysis. And then some people have looked at the emphasis on non-native likeness in both languages if you look across the board. And so all of these are results of studies. Some look like they're native-like, mostly. Some look mostly like native-like in the L2, but then some of them emphasize non-native likeness in both languages. And here's one example of voice onset time production in French and English with respect to those PTK consonants. And what you'll see here is the dark shaded are the bilinguals and the light shaded are the monolinguals. And throughout the lifespan here, I guess it's through, I can't remember how many months, but this is the P up top and then the T and then the K. They never match up. So here are our predictions again. The L2 of simultaneous and early bilinguals are predicted to be native-like on the CPH L2A, non-native-like on the NOB. What is our finding? Non-native-like. So it matches up with an NOB. Over here, the L1 of bilinguals, native-like prediction under the CP, non-native under the NOB, outcome finding, non-native-like. So when we're talking about predictions versus findings, the findings match up better with the predictions of the NOB. So if you circle back, what bilingual infants are capable of is prodigious. Mastery of fundamental aspects predictably takes place. That's the fundamental stuff. But as you stretch things out, we're not sure exactly what's going to go on. And as simultaneous bilinguals move through a lifespan, full monolingual likeness is implausible. Okay. Same thing among late bilinguals. And by the way, note that in parentheses, late bilinguals do not have similar end-state outcomes to simultaneous. Okay. They are different kinds of non-monolingual likeness. And basically, what we want to be able to do is to say that we really don't want to use the native likeness criterion for rejecting the critical period. And if we do, we want to be able to show that CPH affects only late learners. And that's not true because the NOB affects both early and late. And careful, because monolingual standard is really problematic in the first place. And if you want to get into this, there's an article that I can send you that talks about the good and the bad, about comparing natives and non-natives. So here we go. I'm going to talk about French here for a minute. Having gone through all this setup, what does the end state of an Anglophone late learner of French look like? And the answer is it's going to be messy. The answer is that people are going to be all over the place. And so I've identified the places of interest. Here are the reasons that we would have problems. We've already seen the slide. And here are the participants in this study. We have 22 late Anglophone arrivals. They're 18 years or older. They had, as the late arrivals, they had at least 5 years residence, had not been screened for proficiency. So I'm kind of looking at a sample of folks as opposed to cutting off just the high proficient people, all college educated, and they had comparable years of residence. That should be YOR in education. Sorry, that's not true. Years of age for the native controls. So the native controls were monolingual French speakers. We looked at VOT, looked at vowel length. We looked at something that, if you know French, it's kind of cool. There are restrictions on making liaison, and one of them is that you don't make a liaison when you have done an inversion. That's the va-t-on. And the X says you can't make a liaison. And antiner is a made-up word, and you put it in there so that you won't have any kind of lexical effects. You can't say va-t-on antiner. You have to say va-t-on antiner. Okay? Global pronunciation from a pretty cool text by Valérie. Did you know I used to use this for the phonetics course? This was my screening. Yeah. Do you remember reading this out loud one time? Yeah. So, oh, would you love to again? No. Okay. This is so cool. It's so diagnostic, and you can find everything that is problematic with this particular text. Nasals, liaison, intonation patterns, all kinds of cool stuff. Difference between the oo and the u. So this is very diagnostic, and this is the text that I have them read. That's the global pronunciation as opposed to wordless. Morphosyntax, grammaticality judgments for stuff that people had been writing up in the literature that French learners simply cannot do universally. They can't acquire null objects. Null object goes something like this in French. That le there says you can't say it. It means it. So in brackets, the English is the Army finds it difficult to predict new enemy attacks. The French version of that takes out the it. So it would be something like l'armée trouve difficile, as opposed to l'armée le trouve difficile. Exceptional case marking goes something like this. My professors find this poetry to be unworthy of Shakespeare or unworthy of Shakespeare, so it's optional. But in French, it is not optional. You can't put être in there, the to be. Then we have this reflexive pronoun se in a bunch of different types of constructions that don't take direct objects. In other words, unaccusatives. Just for one example, when you turn something green, you have to say verdir. You can't say se verdir. Interestingly enough, you can do that with just about every color change except one, and that's to turn purple. So turning green, turning yellow, turning white, turning black, verdir, jaunir, blanchir, rougir, noircir, etc. But to turn purple, you have to say sans pourpre. So, yeah. I've gone through a long description of these various classes. Some take se. Class 2 does not take se. Class 3, it's either or. Another class, you don't use the se. Yet another class, you do use se. And then there's a 6th class where you have to use se. This is an amazingly complex set of data. And my argument is that this has to be learned item by item by item, and that frequency matters. So high frequency predicates are going to be learned better than low frequency predicates. And I've done a lot of work with native speakers on this, and sure enough, native speakers don't get it all right either. The low frequency natives both, and they get it wrong half the time and guess right half the time. So interestingly, things like change of state. You would expect that change of state would be identical across all change of state verbs. Well, it turns out no, because to flower, it's grammatical without the se. To decompose requires the se. Synonyms should behave the same way, but they don't. Antonyms should behave the same way, and they don't. So we had 7 tests. We had 22 participants. And what do you think the incidence of native likeness is? Where is it the highest? Where is it the lowest? I said a lot about se. I didn't say a lot about VOT, but we talked a lot about VOT before. Global pronunciation. Where do people fail? Where do people fail? Where are people having most difficulty versus less difficulty? Folks in French, folks not in French. Any guesses? Yeah, of all of these tests, where did people do the best, and where did people do the worst? You win. I think I have Texas money here. It's more valuable than Virginia money. A washer and dryer. A Kia. Well, here's what happened. 3 out of my 22 subjects performed in the native range across most of the tests, between 5 or 6 out of 7. And here's the distribution. So vowel length, VOT, liaison, global accent, se, exceptional case marking, and null object. Se was the hardest one, if you look vertically. There are only 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 22. Vowel length, pretty tough too. A check minus means that they're so close it's kind of not worth talking about differences. But ENS, English Native Speaker 6, and ENS 7 and ENS 22 were pretty good. Exceptional case marking, wow, no problem. And look at the VOTs. In a lot of other studies, VOTs were difficult, but in this particular study they were not. And each check mark means that they performed in the native range, in the monolingual French native range. Vowel length is things like, if you say I in French, it's shorter in length than if you say E in English, because you've got an off glide and you measure the milliseconds, and you know that the vowel length in French generally is shorter than in English. So what we have is some evidence of almost native likeness, not confined to limited domains, varying from learner to learner. You don't see across the board native likeness at the level of the individual. Some features of French seem to be more learnable than others, and nothing seems to be totally unlearnable. Somebody got one thing right. There was no test in which nobody behaved native-like. Nobody behaved non-native-like. Two more examples, and then I'll wrap up. I have 75 minutes, is that right? Yeah, okay. Don't give me that opportunity, I'll overdo it. This was a study that has been very, very influential, and this is a grammaticality judgment test, maximum 200. These were Korean, Hungarian immigrants to the United States. They're the ages of arrival. The plot of attainment over age of arrival looks pretty linear, but by the time you get to AOA of around 20 and 30, gosh, it's scattered all over the place. When you look at before 15, gosh, it's scattered all over the place there too. God, that one linear function doesn't capture much of the variance, but we'll come back and talk about that in a minute. 57 Hungarian immigrants. Most of the items came from the Johnson-Newport study. It's predictive, AOA is predicted overall, but it's not predictive among early arrivals. As you see, it's kind of, in the pre-15, it's kind of random. And it's not predictive among late arrivals, likewise random. And according to De Keyser, because you don't have significant AOA effects either pre or post-maturationally, the results are hard to interpret within the critical period hypothesis. The title of the study was Robustness of CP Effects. And so what the purpose of this was, and explicitly stated, was to show that there is such a thing as critical period effects. Now, it turned out to be kind of hard to do that. De Keyser introduced an aptitude variable. Now, aptitude turned out not to be predictive overall. It wasn't predictive among early arrivals, but it was predictive among late arrivals, all right? And then, okay, it's predictive, but among those late arrivals, only those with high aptitude reached near native-like performance in grammaticality judgment. High aptitude was defined as a very interesting way. The maximum was 20. High aptitude was greater than 6 out of 20. It's not very high aptitude. And the average of all the participants was 4.7. So high aptitude was high among low aptitude people. So that's kind of an interesting way of doing this. And summarizing, the critical period geometry is not observed, and this finding is attributed to an artifact of sampling. High aptitude late learners performed in the range of early arrivals, and these results were interpreted as demonstrating robustness. And to me, that's something of a stretch. So I went back and looked at some of the data that were in the appendix of this particular study, and I looked at years of education, the years of education variable. And what I wanted to do was a simple correlation, just to see if education mattered, if education was predictive of outcome. And I had reason to believe that because some studies had found education as a predictor, and this particular study had actually misrepresented, misreported the education variable. So I went in there and did it. Over all participants, education was predicted. Education predicted attainment. Among late arrivals, education predicted attainment. Among early arrivals, education predicted attainment. Among high aptitudes, education predicted attainment. And among low to average, education predicted attainment. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is the variable that I'm interested in because it explains everything. Early, late, high aptitude, low aptitude, overall. And so I'm thinking that, something is missing here because the narrative in the original De Keyser was about finding this connection between age of arrival and proficiency that could be squared somehow with the critical period hypothesis. In order to make sense of it, another mediating factor had to be introduced, and that was aptitude. But by framing the narrative this way, the really robust predictive factor was neglected. And to me, I think if you're doing work like this, you really want to find the variable, not look at just one. You want to find the variable that accounts for most of the results, and that particular variable is education. And to me, that's the fundamental concern when you're doing work, is not to try to force things into a kind of scenario or narrative, but look for what really is going on predictive-wise. And as it turns out, education and aptitude are not themselves correlated and not confounded. So it's not about high education people happen to be high aptitude people. And so if you look at the correlations of aptitude and education, they're non-significant across all these subgroups of participants. Again, we're not talking about some sort of confound of these two variables. So that was, again, I'm trying to give you a sense of looking inside, and now I'm looking beyond the critical period hypothesis. We've looked a lot inside. Now we're starting to look at stuff that's outside of the critical period hypothesis. So to wrap this up, we do have biological and experiential bases. Okay, some are exogenous and some are endogenous. We've got individual differences. We've got bilingualism affecting the timing and especially the extension of the critical period. I want to use this discussion to try to convince you that the monolingual standard is really not the way to, as a criterion to falsify the critical period. And despite these impediments that we've seen, there's an impressive level of acquisition that is seen out there. I want to be clear that it is not all bad news, that is all not doom and gloom, because we do have high levels of attainment as we've seen. The critical period hypothesis and OB make these different predictions. In some senses, they make the same predictions about monolingual likeness. And then to conclude, the nature of bilingualism predicts and is supported by the evidence. Non-monolingual likeness in simultaneous, non-monolingual likeness in early, non-monolingual likeness in late. And what we know is that there are reciprocal effects in both these languages. The second influences the first, and the first influences the second. We've talked about the geometry and timing. We've got several possibilities for the geometry, and we also kind of haven't really nailed down the question of if there are post-maturational AOA effects. And then we are seeing that the work that especially my collaborator Jan van Hove is doing is really bringing sophisticated methods to this kind of analysis with respect to geometry. With large data, we have now some new insights about the magnitude of age of exposure, AOE, how shallow, how severe. There's been previous work with census data by Bialystok and Hakata and by Gillian Stevens. Lots and lots of respondents in the several hundred thousands, but here we've got more granularity. We have a main effect for AOA, we have an education effect, and then we have an interaction between AOA and education. More dispersion of scores. We saw that this kind of trumpet-looking function here as the AOA increases, as well as chronological age. But the general geometry and the general timing are parallel across these various education levels. Going back to what AOA means, we're talking about it's being the initial state of second language acquisition. That's where the L1 is. Conative factors are choice, like I want to do this and I'm motivated to do this. In all these respects, AOA is a meta variable, so don't think it's just age. It's all these associated phenomena that co-vary with age. And what we've talked about is that AOA effects don't really map onto CP effects. There's question of temporal boundedness, question of discontinuity, and matching that discontinuity up to milestones of maturation. And I think that's it.